Welcome to Sisterhood Smarts. Today, I'm very honored to be demystifying the field of psychiatry and the psychotic mind with our smart guest, Jerry Marzinsky, who has been working on the front line of psychiatry for over 40 years. So, we are going to be doing a deep dive into this field. Most of you know that mental health is a big topic, and that is why we are having this very deep conversation with Jerry. Welcome, Jerry. How are you?
Oh, good. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you so much for coming. It's really an honor to have you on. And I think to kind of set the stage for today's conversation, um, could you how tell us a little bit about your journey and how you ended up doing this incredible work, just to set some context for our listeners.
Okay. I don't know how far back you want to go, but I guess it's suffice it to say is, due to my upbringing, I never trusted authority. I mean, you know, so, when I got admitted to Temple University into the psychology program, one thing I hated most about was there was no way to check out what they were telling me. You know, with in engineering or uh, other fields, you can go and you can see for yourself what's happening and what's not. Here these people are telling me, oh, okay, all this stuff is true, you just have to believe us. And that was hard for me to do. um, and I also knew that in psychology in the universities, it's publish or perish. You either publish or you're out of the game. So uh, you know I watched what they were publishing, and a lot of it was just garbage. I mean, it was just anything that they could get published. And then I saw a report, um, with regard to, I think I had a copy of it somewhere, but regard to the publications of psychology, 80% of what was published as research was not replicable when this organization went to check. So that means 80% of what they're telling the population and the university and students is is garbage. It's just garbage. It's not replicable. And I started wondering when I was in undergraduate school. When I hit abnormal psychology, there was just an immediate attraction. It was like, what's wrong with these people? And they didn't say what was wrong with them. All they gave was a description of these different kinds of mental illnesses. Nowhere was there anything about what was causing them. You
Mhm.
know? And then as I got into graduate school, it was, oh, it's a biochemical imbalance of their brain. But this started off well before that. It started off, I think, in the 50s. They were blaming mothers for their sons and daughters being schizophrenic. It was like, the mother did something to that caused this. And the mothers are going, wait a minute, we didn't do anything. What did we do? So that blew over. So now they didn't know what caused schizophrenia. They had no idea. So that left them kind of looking kind of dumb. So then they came up with something that couldn't be checked out easily. They started saying, oh, it's a genetic disorder. There's some genes that are out of whack somewhere. You know, they didn't have any evidence for that. They just needed to look like they knew what they were doing. And they got away with that for, I don't know, a decade or so. And then some geneticists, I mean, most geneticists aren't interested in schizophrenia. So there's no way to disprove them. They put all this stuff in their advertisements and they teach it in the universities. By the way, the universities are taken over, especially in the field of medical and psychiatry and psychology, by big pharma. Okay.
Wow.
That happened in, I think, 1910 with the Flexner report, where the Rockefellers uh, paid these researchers to find out who was teaching what in the US. And they paid off Congress to make it illegal for universities to teach anything except um, pharmaceutical medicine. Okay. So naturopathy, electrical therapies, what are the with the pins? I mean, all those different therapies were now made illegal. All right. They, in order for a doctor to practice, he had to graduate from an institution that was teaching pharmacological medicine. Right. So they took over the educational system at that point, paid off Congress to do it, passed their laws to benefit them, not the people. Okay? And the medical establishment, psychiatry, psychology, has been under their control ever since. All right. Um, and you'll look at it even now. They're advertising medicines for everything. There's no other type of cure. It's only medicines. So since they didn't have an idea of what was causing schizophrenia, they just kicked it up to where it couldn't be investigated very easily at all. And that they started saying, oh, it's the genes. They didn't have any evidence for that at the time they did it. And, geneticists weren't really interested in investigating schizophrenia, so they looked like they had an explanation. Oh, it's genetic, and there's nothing you can do about it except take our meds. But after a while, there were some geneticists who did start doing research into schizophrenia, and they didn't find any genetic markers for schizophrenia. And they published that. So what the psychiatric establishment and big pharma came back and they went, well, it's not just a specific gene, it's a whole bunch of genes and they're all mixed together, and eventually we'll find out what it is. But right now we don't know, but we're pretty sure it's a genetic kind of thing. So they went along with that for decades until some honest geneticist came along, started doing the research and said, hey, we don't see any genetic marker for schizophrenia. It's just not there. So they had to come up with something else, something that couldn't be investigated easily. So they came up with the biochemical imbalance garbage. Now that was come up by a drug manufacturer by the name of Eli Lilly back when their Prozac came out, and they needed some explanation for how it worked. So they go, well, it somehow affects serotonin. And it's a chemical, so there must be a chemical imbalance that this thing fixes. They went on with that for decades, and they're still doing it right now. They're still publishing that in their advertisements for schizophrenic medications. Oh, it's believed that it's a chemical imbalance. That was disproven years ago. Right? I have the documentation here somewhere, but one of the higher ups in psychiatry said it's a myth. No well-trained psychiatrist believes that there's a biochemical imbalance. Right? Now, I didn't know that when I went to work at one of the biggest psychiatric hospitals on the planet in Milledgeville, Georgia. But what I did see was when I asked psychiatrists, what causes this? What's the cause of schizophrenia? I mean, what's with all these people that are locked up here? And, they say, oh, it's a chemical imbalance in the brain. But one thing I never saw after years was, you think if there's a chemical imbalance somewhere, they would need to take some kind of baseline to figure out what chemicals in the brain are out of balance and by how much. I never, ever saw a psychiatrist do that. They would come into the psychiatrist's office. The psychiatrist would spend 15, 20 minutes with them. Then they just kind of it was like a crapshoot. Well, we'll try this drug first. And if that doesn't work, we'll try another one. And if that doesn't work, we'll try another one. So there was no baseline. So there's 23 or so neurotransmitters in the brain. They had no idea what was out of balance or by how much. I found out later that they had no idea what the chemical balance of the brain should even be, let alone what was out of balance. It's all a fabrication. And they're still pushing it in their advertisements. So it was bizarre. It was just absolutely bizarre. And I'd ask psychiatrists. I remember asking one, well, how do you know what's out of balance if you don't have any kind of baseline? And he went, well, the drug companies tell us. They do all that research and we just follow it. And I'm like, thinking to myself, like, that's like letting the fox in the hen house. What are you talking about? How could you do this? But that's what they were doing.
Yeah. But it's so it's we're dealing with human beings, and most human beings are unique. Circumstances are different, genetics are different. You can't just have a cookie cutter, like one size fits all. And I guess for our listeners, people say schizophrenia, but what is it, Jerry? Because we don't want to use the dictionary definition. We want to really understand, what is it, and does it manifest in just one way where they can say, just take this pill? It's like, okay, even headaches are different, but this is something more complex. You can't just say someone has a headache, one has a migraine, one has, there are different reasons, even for something as simple as a headache. So can you just help us understand from your perspective, with your background and experience, what is schizophrenia and how does it manifest and in which forms?
Well, there are several different forms of it. The one I was concerned about the most was paranoid schizophrenia because it's the most common.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now there are other kinds. There's hebephrenic. There's undifferentiated. There's usually the paranoid schizophrenics are hearing voices. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now there's other forms of it that I couldn't do anything with. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when I got to the state hospital, everybody believed that the voices were hallucinations because that's what they were taught in school. That's what they were taught in undergraduate and graduate school and medical school. The voices are hallucinations. Okay? There's no research ever done on that. It's just the psychiatrist just went, well, that's what they seem to be. So we hereby declare that the voices are hallucinations. Okay? Without any research whatsoever. They reminded me of the Egyptian priests of old. It is because we say it is. Okay?
I know, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, again, the category I was most interested in, it was the one that was most common, and that was paranoid schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
And these people are paranoid, and they are hearing voices. Okay. And nobody, when I got into the state hospital, was the least bit interested in what those voices were telling these people. It's like I'd ask them. I'd ask psych nurses. I'd ask attendants. I'd ask psychiatrists. Well, what are the voices? Well, they're hallucinations. It's like, since they already felt they knew, they weren't looking for any other answer.
Yeah, and what is a hallucination? These are, again, these broad words.
Well,
that, yeah.
The last 10 years of my, I was working, before I retired, I was working in the emergency rooms in all the major hospitals around Tucson. So I've seen hallucinations. They're random. They're all over the place. You can't predict a hallucination. What's going to happen?
Mm-hmm.
But back when I was in the state hospital, I started asking questions to the patients about what these voices were telling them. Okay. And one of the psychiatrists found out, and I was pulled up into his office on the red carpet, and he told me the voices are hallucinations. This patient told me that you're asking questions about the voices, and he was upset. Okay. So I found out later that the voices don't like to be asked questions or to be investigated. They get upset. So I have no doubt that the voices had this guy go tell the psychiatrist this. And here's a psychiatrist telling me the voices are hallucinations. You will not be asking questions to these patients about what the voices are saying, because what you're doing is reinforcing these hallucinations, and you're making the patients worse. So I was ordered to stop, but I'd already gone far enough to see that the voices, in my opinion, were not hallucinations. They started running patterns from the people I talked to. Now, it took about a year to figure out how to talk to these people, because there was no positive benefit to them talking about their voices. You look at what happens to them. They tell their friends about their voices, and the friends go, "Well, you're possessed. You're weird." And they just back away. The voices tell them, if you tell anybody about us, they will think you're crazy and they will have you locked up. Unfortunately, that's what happens a lot of the time. So they tell their parents get upset, take them to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist fills them full of these toxic drugs that turn them into semi-zombies and make them feel horrible. And they don't want to take these drugs. I mean, virtually every schizophrenic I've worked with has at some point gone off of those drugs because they're so awful. They're toxic. They're virtually major tranquilizers that turn the person into a semi-zombie. Okay, so I had to be very careful because I ended up being warned twice by two different psychiatrists at the state hospital about asking questions about the voices. By the time they got to me, I suspected strongly they weren't hallucinations, because what all these patients were telling me is that these voices are consistently negative. They're derogatory, they're insulting, they're abusive, they're destructive. They may be positive for short periods of time, but they invariably turn around and gang up on the patient. And this was consistent. Virtually all of them were saying that the voices were negative. Mm-hmm. And my question was, what holds them on such a negative trajectory? Why aren't they random like all other hallucinations? Why aren't they all over the place? Why aren't they, some of them positive, some of them neutral, some of them negative? Why aren't they like regular hallucinations? Now, that was the first pattern that I spotted. They were consistently negative. They would tell the patient, you're no good, you're rotten, you're ugly, you're stupid, your parents don't love you, nobody likes you, you're awful, you're a terrible human being. I mean, virtually every negative thing that you could think of to say to a person, these things are saying to these people. Okay. The second pattern that came out was that they were anti-religious. I had patient after patient come and tell me that the voices didn't like them reading the Bible. They didn't like them going to churches. And what I actually saw was on the psychiatric rehab building where I was working, when the chaplain had an ice cream social downstairs in the auditorium, invited all the patients, the only ones from my ward that didn't go were the schizophrenics. They all decided to stay on the dingy ward, either watching television or staring at the ceiling, but they never went. So I started asking, why aren't you down there with the other guys? I mean, getting cake and ice cream. You don't get that very often here. I don't like preachers. I don't want to be preached to. I don't like sermons. I don't believe in the Bible. I don't believe in God. God's abandoned me. I don't go to church. I don't want anything to do with it. So the voices, I started asking these people questions about what happened when they did go to church. And what I found, they broke down into three different categories. If the voices were very weak and they attempted to go to church, the voices would shut up. They wouldn't say anything in church. If they were of moderate strength, they would get louder. And they would interfere with what the preacher was saying, or they would start mocking the preacher or mocking what he was saying. So they were trying to block out anything coming in from the preacher. And if they were very strong, they would actually drive the person out of the church. They would get up and run out. So it broke up into three different categories. So the anti-religious was the second consistent pattern that these things ran. So I'm thinking, if they're running patterns, they can't be hallucinations. And what else did I see there? So the biochemical imbalance thing didn't make any sense to me, because I never saw the psychiatrist ever doing any kind of baseline. You'd think if there was a chemical imbalance of some kind, they'd need some kind of baseline. Any of you who are going to psychiatrists for schizophrenia, ask them, where's your baseline? If I got a chemical imbalance, what's out of balance? What's that, and by how much? They will not have an answer. This was completely fabricated. Okay.
Because they have to run tests, right? Do some blood work. I don't know how they do
No,
it.
they have no blood work. They have no tests. There is no tests for it.
But it's biochemical.
It's not
I understand
biochemical.
what biochemical means. That's the body, right?
That's the body.
The human anatomy. Yeah, you have
Right.
to find
They're-
the chemical imbalance within the
Yep.
body, right?
But they have no test for schizophrenia. There is no test. They don't exist for a chemical imbalance in the brain.
Okay, but one of the diagnoses is that you have a biochemical imbalance.
Well, that's what they say the cause is, but they have no proof for it. Matter of fact, it's been solidly disproved at this point, but they got away with that for another decade. So they don't know what causes schizophrenia. They won't investigate the voices because they think they're hallucinations. It's the voices that power schizophrenia. Once the voices are gotten rid of by any means, all symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia disappear with them.
Yeah. And Jerry, what do you believe, or what do you believe these voices are?
These voices are negative entities. They are conscious. They're aware. They are also parasites. So you might call them the Archons or evil spirits. They speak to the patient. Now, what's so sneaky about them is that they sound just like the thousands of other voices that you hear going through your head on a regular day. Okay, so everybody's hearing a voice in their head talking to them.
Is that what they call negative self-talk or self-sabotaging behavior?
Well, that's
just gloss over it,
right. Right. So, but those ideas, those thoughts are put there by these entities, and they don't just hit the schizophrenics. They hit us all. Every single one of us. Every time you have a nasty negative thought come into your mind. So, see, what people believe is because they experience these thoughts in their head, they believe that they belong to them. That's very wrong. Your brain is like a radio receiver. Now, a Christian mystic, Emanuel Swedenborg, this is where we first came to the conclusion that these voices were something different than the person's thoughts. So there was a clinical psychologist, Wilson Van Dusen, who was a Swedenborgian. Now, Emanuel Swedenborg was a Christian mystic who lived some 300 years ago. He was the chief mining engineer for the Queen of Sweden. He was one of the top scientists of his day. He was like the Leonardo da Vinci of his day. I mean, he was highly educated. He went to many universities. He was psychic. He made the Queen of Sweden a fortune being his chief mining engineer. He was a metallurgist. He studied medical stuff. He was one of the few that knew most of what there was to know in his day. But at the age of 50, he says Christ appeared to him and said, "Okay, now stop all this scientific stuff." He said, "I'm going to give you access to heaven and hell, and I'm going to give you free access to talk to the beings that reside there. I want you to go visit with these people and come back and write about what you saw, so the people on the planet have some idea what heaven and hell is like."
Okay.
So he did that, and he published volumes of books. Now, Wilson Van Dusen was a Swedenborgian, and he was reading the works of Swedenborg, but he was also a clinical psychologist at his state hospital in Northern California. Now, as Swedenborg is describing his interviews with these evil spirits in hell, Van Dusen noticed that the patterns that he was seeing and the material that these voices were, these evil spirits were telling him, matched exactly what the voices were telling Van Dusen's schizophrenic patients.
Wow. So
there's a one-to-one correlation. So Van Dusen saw this, but he was very guarded because he knew how the rest of the psychology profession would react to this. So he continued to call them hallucinations, but everything else he said countered that. All right. So he was trying to cover himself. Right? And he did some very interesting experiments. Now, unlike me, where I knew they were evil from the start, I knew they were destroying these patients. I had seen it over and over and over again. What he was
How
trying...
did you figure it out, Jerry? How did you figure out? Because I think most psychiatrists are just like, okay, hallucination here. How did you figure out that your patients, the voices your patients were hearing were actually real life entities?
Well, that took me a long time. And even though the evidence was absolutely overwhelming, I still didn't want to believe it.
I know. Yeah, it's not a simple process,
Yeah,
actually.
I didn't want to believe in demons. I didn't want to believe that I was working with people who were possessed by demons. I just kept thinking, oh, it's got to be something to do with their subconscious. It's got to be some other thing. It's got to, and I kept making excuses. But as I had no lack of patients to work with. Okay, the state hospital was full of schizophrenic patients. Now, if I've never ever seen a researcher from the outside come to the front lines in any of the institutions I was working at, and many of them, none of them would come to the front lines and investigate this stuff. It was all through the universities, who were already taken over by the Rockefellers and Big Pharma. They were wanting to sell drugs. They were wanting to convince people that the only answer is their expensive, toxic drugs. They'd already taken over the medical system. They'd already taken over psychology and psychiatry. Okay? So when I saw that they didn't have any chemical imbalance, or there was no proof for it, they didn't test for it, there were no tests for it. But what I saw is these things were consistently running patterns. So the more patients I talked to, the more patterns began to come out. And with each additional pattern, that was even more proof that these things were not hallucinations, which are random. They're all over the place. Okay. So what holds them to these patterns? So another pattern I've found at the state hospital was that after these voices attacked these patients, they were completely drained of energy. Over and over and over again. And I'd ask them, well, where did that energy go? All you were doing was laying in your bed, tossing and turning all night. You didn't use it. Where did it go? They go, well, I don't know. So another pattern appeared that the patients themselves didn't even recognize. They would just know that they felt bad after the voices attacked them. And the voices were horrible. They would tell them rotten things about themselves. They'd keep them up all night, badgering them, mocking them, making fun of them, telling them awful things, that the voices were going to kill them, or that people were watching them, or somebody was tracking them to kill them. I mean, anything they could do to make the patient upset. Okay. And I had one patient tell me that they could feel their energy leaving when these voices were attacking. Right. So I said, that's very interesting. So I started asking these patients, after the voices attack, how do you feel? Every single one of them said they were drained. They didn't have any energy. One of them said that they were so tired, it was as if they were digging ditches in the hot sun all day. That's how little energy they had. And I'd ask them, I'd say, well, where did that energy go? You were laying in bed, tossing and turning all night. You didn't use it. Where did it go? And the vast majority would say, I don't know. They wouldn't know. So the more I asked, saying, did you feel this loss of energy after the voices showed up? Virtually all of them would say yes. All right. So I did a little experiment, like it was a 1 to 10 type thing. How much energy did you have before the voices showed up? How much energy did you have after the voices showed up? It wasn't real heavy duty science. And, it would be like, okay, I had 5 or 6, my energy level before the voices showed up. Then afterward, it would be, one or two. It was clear that their energy level was clearly dropped, after the voices showed up. So we did an analysis of variance on that, and it turned out to be statistically significant. Something is happening there. Their energy is disappearing after the voices attack. Right? So I would ask them. I'd say, okay, if if the voices have come thousands of times, and every time they came, your energy level dropped to nothing, where do you think it went? The common answer was, I don't know. They weren't even thinking about it. And when I mentioned it, then they come to thinking about it. But I would say 85% of them still didn't know. So I'd tell them, I said, okay, if you stuck your hand in a fire 1,000 times and each time you got burned, what was burning you? They didn't have any trouble saying the fire. Then I'd go back and I'd say, okay, if the voices came 1,000 times in the last few years, maybe more, 10,000 times, and every time the voices came, you were devoid of energy, where'd your energy go? Still, about 85% of them would say, I don't know. The others would think about it and go, the voices took it? I said, well, that makes sense, doesn't it? Where else would it go? You didn't use it. And it turned out that was a piece of information that the voices absolutely didn't want them to have.
Wow. Okay.
They did not want them to know that they were parasites. Because if you had a leech on you, you wouldn't just sit there and go, oh, well, I got a leech on me, would you? You would want to get rid of that thing, right?
Of course. Yeah.
Well, that's the same thing with the voices. Once the patients realized that they were parasites, that they were stealing their life energy, their attitude toward them changed. Okay? Now they became an enemy. Okay? And that's what's got to happen. So there's two things that have to happen for somebody to recover fully from schizophrenia. Is one, they have to understand that those voices are not them. Even though they appear to be in their head, they do not come from them. They come from the outside. Now, what Swedenborg said is that none of your thoughts come from you. They either come from either heaven or they come from hell. All right. But he says your brain is, today we would say, it's like a radio receiver. It's tuned to a certain frequency, and you pick up that frequency of thought. Okay. Now, schizophrenics are tuned to a very low frequency. They're picking up low frequency transmissions.
Interesting. Yeah. So this is what attracts, this is why certain people are more affected than others.
Well, because their frequency is lowered. So if you look at the history of schizophrenics, very few of them have not suffered some kind of very nasty, ugly, traumatic, physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. Virtually all of them have suffered that kind of abuse. So what that does is it lowers their frequency because, they make certain decisions about who they are as a result of that abuse. It's like, well, I'm no good. I'm horrible. I'm a bad person because otherwise why would these people be abusing me like this? So during that abuse, when their attention is turned on them, they make a decision as to why that abuse is happening. And far too often, it is because I'm a bad person, or I'm unworthy, or I'm no good, or I'm stupid. And that decision sticks with them for the rest of their lives. So they are now operating at a less than optimal frequency, a lower frequency.
Yeah, but Jerry, even the abuser, because when you're describing these negative, people, I think people just gloss over it and say, oh, that's negative self-talk. The TED Talks, they're always calling it this, negative self-talk or self-sabotaging behavior. But now I'm thinking that even the abuser possibly must have had these negative thought forms to abuse somebody.
Yes.
Because I always wondered about when I talk to people, it could be work colleagues or anybody, neighbors, anybody, and they tell you about, oh, I don't like this person, and I always asked why, and they said, oh, it's
that's why because no, it's a thought, all right. But
Yeah,
what it
I'm like,
is
did they
it
harm your dog? Did they harm your cat? No, they've done nothing to
no,
me.
it's a
It's discernment.
program,
And I'm like, that's not discerning. The person has done absolutely nothing to you,
right?
but you're causing them problems in your neighborhood, at your work, at your job. And now you're really explaining a lot of dysfunction in society.
Yeah. So what happens is that's a like a computer virus running in the background of their mind. Okay,
Hmm.
and it's a decision that they made. Now, if anybody shows up in their psychic sphere who looks or acts or reminds them of that abuser, whoever did that thing to them, then there's going to be the reaction that you just mentioned. I don't like that person. I don't know why. He irritates me. I don't want anything to do with him. So there's a flight or fight reaction that fires off. Okay, it's either they take that person on, or they avoid them, or um, they run from them. Okay, and
Yeah.
there's a new energetic therapy. I'll talk to more about that later. It's called
Yes,
the
please.
Mace energy method. Okay,
Uh-huh.
it will go in. I've never seen anything work like this. It will go
Okay.
in and it will remove that programming within an hour and get rid of it. It's an energetic therapy. So thoughts are energy, um, feelings are energy, memory is energy. What psychiatry and psychology are doing is only treating the results or the symptoms of that cause. So psychiatry is only treating the symptoms of schizophrenia. It's not dealing with the cause at all. They don't even know what the cause is. They're just trying to get rid of the symptoms and sell drugs. They're making what is it, 4.7 billion? I'm not talking million, $1 billion a year selling antipsychotic drugs worldwide that cure absolutely nothing and do more physiological damage than most other drugs. These drugs will neurologically, with long-term use, destroy your nervous system. They will shrink your brain. And that happened in the psychiatric hospitals when they started doing autopsies on these people who were long-term on these antipsychotic drugs. They saw that their brains were shrunk like walnuts. So the researchers who did that published it, said, we suspect this is due to the antipsychotic drugs. Of course, the psychiatric mafia and big pharma jump in there and go, no, it's not the psychiatric drugs. It's the schizophrenia doing that. The schizophrenia is doing it. And the researchers said, well, okay, let's see. So they started feeding antipsychotic drugs to monkeys, rats, and mice, and they found the same thing was happening. Okay, so with long-term use, these drugs are destructive to the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. They don't want you to know that. Matter of fact, I don't think most psychiatrists are aware of it because it's the big pharma's keeping it hidden. You don't see it on a warning label. You don't see that research anywhere. The big pharma controls what these journals are putting out. They control what is being published in the universities. Through their grants. You publish something we don't like, we're not going to give you grants for this, this, and this. You publish something that we like, and we'll give you a lot of money. They're very rich. They bought off the U.S. Congress to get this nonsense passed that the only valid medical treatment is, based around drugs. And you look at these, they advertise them on television. All these side effects of drugs. Oh, it could kill you. It could maim you. It could cause you a heart attack. And still, they're selling them. It doesn't matter. So it's almost like psychiatry. That Hippocratic oath thing. It's like they take that and they just trashed it.
Yeah, but that is horrible that it's shrinking your brain.
Yes, with
Do you know how
long-term
many
use, it does
people?
neurological damage. Now, the new drugs they have out now have fewer side effects, but they still are neurotoxins. You look at some of these
Your
side effects for these things.
please,
I have a list of side effects here somewhere. They're
please,
horrendous.
Jerry, list them because I'll tell you here in Scandinavia, like you hardly ever know anybody who's not on some kind of medication. This kind of I don't want to say mental health medication, something to balance their emotions or panic attacks or anxiety or something. And some people they're not on one or two. Some are on a couple, and they tell people even joke about it here, and they say, oh, this one is on a happy pill. I don't think people know the side effects are decapitating and
No,
this
no, no,
serious. If
they
you knew
don't.
something was going to shrink your brain and
Right.
act as a neurotoxin, I don't think you would be joking about it.
Well, there's some people that are so far gone that there is no other treatment for them. They, especially, the ones I saw in the prison, they have to be on those drugs the rest of their lives because they're so far gone. There's nothing that can be done for them. Now, for the vast majority of people who are hearing voices and are still somewhat functioning, uh, or able to be reached, you know, and I have to admit that there's a number of those people that I would not have been able to reach had it not been for these drugs. So those drugs are basically major tranquilizers that calm them down. Okay. Now,
Mm-hmm.
the voices don't want them calmed down. Keep in mind that these voices are parasites. They feed off of negative emotional energy. So that's why everything they tell the patient is negative. You're no good. You're stupid. You're rotten. We're going to kill you. There's somebody tracking you. There's somebody staring in your window. There's a monster under your bed. There's a monster. All this horrible stuff is to generate the negative emotional energy that these things feed off of. So once they flare that up, then that energy is taken. Now, I have no idea how they take it. I did have a couple of patients tell me they could feel their energy leaving while the voices were abusing them, but I have no idea how they actually withdraw it from the people. But there's a one-to-one correspondence. So those of you who are working with schizophrenics or have a schizophrenic son or daughter, ask them yourself. Ask them, do the voices only say negative stuff? 99% of the time it will be negative. What do the voices do when you repeat the 23rd Psalm? That's the first one I saw. A patient came to me, said, when I repeated the 23rd Psalm, the voices reacted like worms thrown onto a hot frying pan. They did not like it. They got very upset. So I started handing out the 23rd Psalm, and we got the same reaction from scores of them until one of the bosses saw that I was doing that and ordered me to stop doing it. Okay.
Why would he order you to stop doing it? Were you receiving like very good feedback? Was it being was were the
Well,
patients
when I first started
getting
off,
better?
I went, well, these things are bad. These
Mhm.
these things are bad. So whatever they don't like, I'm going to give them more of it.
Okay.
Because if you didn't like something,
Makes sense. Yeah.
and somebody started giving you more of it, you would want to get out. You would want to get away from them, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's like
Right.
when you're detoxing, if you
Right.
want to get parasites, you give them the bitters. You take the
Yes.
bitters in, right? Yeah,
Yes.
it
So
makes sense.
when I first started off, it was
Mm.
like, okay, what do these things don't like? And I would
Mm-hmm.
tell the patient to give them more of it. Now, the problem with that is that the voices get more upset when they do that. Okay.
Okay.
So they
Mm-hmm.
have to weather through that. So they have to want to fight back against these things. So what these voices are doing is pushing their personality out of the way and trying to take over to where they can generate more negative emotional energy by getting the patient to do crazy, stupid things that get them in trouble and then cause more angst. Okay. So in most people, there's a pushback against the original personality. But once I've seen several that have been completely taken over, there's no help from them. You can't reach them. The only thing they could do is take medicines. But for the vast majority of people that are hearing voices, you know, if 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 they can't keep them under control,
Mm-hmm.
then they can start taking these meds for a while to calm them down and then go find a Mace practitioner who can help them and get rid of these things. Okay. If if they can't take a stand against them, then they're gone. But these things are very tricky. There's virtually scores of patients that I've worked with in the state prison when I was working in the psychology department there, or in the state hospital. They would ask these voices, "Who are you? What are you?" Because they were just as curious about what these things were as I was. The
Mm-hmm.
voices would
That's
come back
fantastic.
and they would say, "We are you,"
We in plural.
in plural.
So you have
We
plural aspects of
we are
yourself.
you.
They're telling you
So
that's
they
interesting.
want the patient to believe that those thoughts that they're putting into their mind is actually who they are. If they can get you to believe that those thoughts belong to you,
Hmm.
then you're in worse shape than if you go, they're not coming in from me, they're coming in from this evil enemy source, and I need to block them or do something about that. You know, see, once you see that you have an enemy, then you have something to fight against.
Yeah,
But
once
if
you've
you
identified the enemy, you know what it is, then now you're closer to the solution.
right,
Yes.
you have something you can fight back against. But if you
Yes.
believe it's you, who are you going to fight back against? Yourself. That's why there's like 50,000 suicides in the U.S. every year.
It's also
50,000
increasing
people
here in
kill themselves.
Scandinavia, Jerry. It's also increasing here. It's also increasing here in Scandinavia, the suicide rate.
Yeah, it's horrendous. And
Yeah.
each one of those patients, before they kill themselves, and a lot of them are on antipsychotic drugs or antidepressant drugs. All right. So they have a thought put into their head to just kill yourself. You know, you can't. There's nothing else for you to do. You're helpless. You know, just get it over with. And that's what the voices tell them. Just get it over with. You just do it. Get it over with. Yeah. So 50,000 people in the U.S. every year are doing that. Now you look at
50,000.
50,000. That's as
Wow.
many people who died in Vietnam. That's how many soldiers died in Vietnam from here. Okay. 132 people kill themselves every day in the U.S. So you look at what's going on with the current psychiatric mafia and big pharma and the psychiatric mafia. There's more psychiatrists, psychologists, um, and psychiatric drugs on the planet right now than there has ever been in the history of mankind. And yet, mental illness is rampant. You got
It's
50,000
rampant,
people killing
Jerry.
themselves in the U.S. every year. We're getting worse as a country here.
But I think it's the same thing here in Europe because the list, there are always new names. Now we're being introduced to PTSD, panic attacks, and there's so many different names you can hardly keep up. And these are now things you have to educate yourself with if you're working as a teacher, an instructor, an educator, because the children are coming in with these, um, you know, diagnoses. So you have to
Yeah,
know how to
yeah. Well, see,
relate to them and handle it.
that's
Yeah.
another thing with these diagnoses. People
Mm-hmm.
react to those diagnoses as if they're a medical diagnosis. They are not.
Mm-hmm.
Every
Wow.
single one of those diagnoses has been made up. It's completely made up. Okay, so what they have is a panel of I don't know, 13 psychiatrists that meet every few years. They make these diagnoses up. There is not a single test. There's not a single objective test for any of them. None of them.
None?
None.
PTSD,
These
tell
things,
me. I don't
they're
even know all the names, but there are many. There are maybe 10, 15, or 20. There are many. There are many. It's a
they're,
long list.
well, there is a long list. Okay, it's a work of fiction. They teach it in the universities as it's the Bible. I remember when I was in the PhD program, you had to memorize all these diagnoses and the symptoms. All they are is symptoms. They're symptoms of human behavior that
Mm-hmm.
are taken and pathologized. So every single one of the 296 that exist right now in the DSM-5 have been completely made up. They're fabricated. In 1952, there was
Mm-hmm.
the DSM-1 had 106 psychiatric diagnoses. The DSM-5 has 290. Well, in 1980, the DSM 4, I think it was, had 256 diagnoses. Now the DSM-5 has 297, almost 300. They're making these things up as they go along. There is no proof. There's no test for any of them. 2/3 of the psychiatrists who are working to make these things up have strong ties to big pharma. And what I've heard is that meeting that they have is like a tobacco barn. Somebody comes in and goes, "Hey, I got an idea for a new psychiatric diagnosis," and they read it off, and these are the symptoms, and then they go, "Well, you think we can make a medicine that would treat those symptoms?" And if so, they'll add it to the diagnosis. So there are no blood tests, there's no lab tests, there's no X-rays, there's nothing to objectify any of these diagnoses. It's not a true condition. These things are made up.
I don't even know how we can begin to explain this to anybody, because it's just like finality, the way it's addressed here. People come in already set.
Yeah.
And people also claim it by the way they speak. They say, I am, I am, or, I suffer from, they already claim that label of those diagnoses.
Yeah.
They embrace it.
That's too bad. But let me cap this off. This is a statement by a psychiatrist, and one of the top psychiatrists in the country has also verified this. This guy says every single one of these mental illnesses were fabricated by breaking up segments of human behavior and pathologizing them. There are no blood tests, there are no lab tests, there's no X-rays, EEGs to validate a single one of these diagnoses. They are just classes of behaviors that a group of psychiatrists have voted to be a mental disorder. This was by Dr. Julian Whitaker, MD. Okay. And Dr. Ronald Pies, the head of the Psychiatric Times, also verifies the same thing. These are made up. There's no test to verify any of them. They're all subjective diagnoses. They have some of them. They have mathematics disorder. So if you don't like math, you're disordered. They have sibling rivalry disorder. So if two kids are fighting, that's a disorder.
Stop.
They have caffeine toxic disorder. If you drink too much coffee, you're disordered.
And what is too much? Because we all have a different resistance.
It doesn't matter to them.
Coffee is culture.
It doesn't matter to them. They have one called Paris syndrome. I think it was Japanese who visit Paris, and we would call this culture shock back in my day, But now it's a Paris syndrome disorder. Okay, and they recommend it be treated with antidepressant medications. That's how big a scam this stuff is, and they've got the entire planet tuned into listening to this horse crap. Because what they're saying is people
abroad, everybody will experience some degree of culture shock. You're adjusting. It's a different weather. Everything's different. The weather, the food, the climate, your whole life is different. So you need some adjustment time. Is this culture?
Yeah. So everything is aimed towards selling drugs. I mean, the whole system is aimed toward big pharma selling drugs. Now, these antidepressants, these SSRIs, this is just a short list of the side effects of antidepressant drugs that cure nothing. Okay? Nausea, weight gain, trouble sleeping, dry mouth, blurred vision, dizziness, anxiety, headache, diarrhea or constipation, sexual problems, fatigue, tremors, increased swelling, lower alcohol tolerance, bleeding, lower sodium levels, vomiting, restlessness, muscle cramps, seizures. Okay? And it goes on and on. The antipsychotic drugs are even worse than that. Okay? So you were asking me what these things say. They say, Sherry Sweeney, the co-author of our book.
Oh yeah, we had her on. Yes.
Yeah, we wrote. She says. Now you can get this over Amazon. It talks about how we came to the conclusion that these things are entities. Okay, it's called An Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind. Sherry Sweeney says every negative thought that comes into your mind is put there by them. Okay, and that seems to match what Swedenborg is saying, since he's saying that None of your thoughts are your own. They either come in from heaven or they come in from hell. Right? So, one of the big things that we teach all schizophrenics is that 98% of what these voices are telling them are lies. They
Yeah,
don't,
Sherry
they,
told us about that. That's a
right.
lie program.
That's a
Yeah.
lie program. So
Mm-hmm.
I knew that even before I met Sherry, but Sherry actually cured herself using that program itself, just that one alone,
Oh, yeah.
knowing that you can't believe anything these voices say. They're consummate liars. I had one patient where they told him, okay, if you gouge out your eye,
Oh.
we will go away. We'll never come back. So he did that. As soon as he did that, the voices came back and started mocking him, saying, look how stupid you are. You listened to us. Now you're maimed for the rest of your life. You look like a freak, and started mocking him and laughing at him. So that's what we're dealing with. That's the kind of force that we're dealing with. Right? So you asked a while ago, how did I come to the conclusion that these things were entities and not hallucinations?
Yeah.
So what I had was I was collecting these patterns, okay, and it was pattern after pattern after pattern after pattern. So they would energetically drain the victims. They got louder after sunset. They got louder when ignored. They would foster self-destructive behavior. They'd foster isolation. They'd demand the attention of the victim. They'd maneuver for increased control. They would gaslight. They'd manipulate perception. They have access to the patient's memory. They demand that the victim not tell anybody else about them. So we have 23 of these patterns right now. You can find them on my website at jerrymarzinsky.com. Okay. So with each one of these patterns that I saw, it was like, okay, these can't be hallucinations. So I'd start going, while I was working in the state hospital, I could not experiment a lot to see what I could do to interfere with these things. Because if the psychiatrist found out that I believed these things were something other than hallucinations and that I was trying stuff to see how they would react, I would be in trouble. Matter of fact, the psychiatrists were being assaulted by paranoid schizophrenics at a rate equal to that of attendants on the psych wards who were with them 24 hours a day. So they were being assaulted at a horrendous rate by paranoid schizophrenics. And I remember seeing that and going, what are they saying to these people that are ticking them off in the 15 or 20 minutes they see them a month? What could they possibly be saying to these people that are getting them assaulted? It took me 7 years to figure that out. And it was toward the end of the 7th year when I was there was one gal who was doing good in her cosmetology program. I mean, she was about to graduate with a license so she could work. But the rule we had, if they went off their meds 3 times, we would discharge them from the program, because at that time we'd know no other thing to do beside give them the meds. And if they wouldn't take the meds, they weren't going to stay sane. So she went off a 3rd time. I notified her mother, well, we're going to discharge her from the program. The mother went, no, don't do that. I can't deal with her. I'll come up there and we'll talk to her. We'll find out why she went off her meds. And I said, well, okay, come on up. She came up one Friday afternoon, and the mother and I were in the room, and both of us are like, why did she do this? She was just on the verge of graduating. So that's another thing they do. They sabotage any kind of success you're about to have. They will get you to do something to sabotage it. That's consistent. Okay. So I was asking, we asked this gal, why did you do that? You were about to graduate. You were about to take your final. You would have had a license. You would have been a licensed cosmetologist. Why did you do this? She goes, you won't believe me. I said, I've heard a lot of crazy things while I'm here. Just let it fly. Okay? She said, the voices told me that the psychiatrist was poisoning me with these drugs. Now, I just read you some of the after side effects of those drugs. Okay? Those drugs are toxic. Yeah, they are toxic. All right. So all these side effects, they are actually being poisoned by these drugs. And these side effects are the toxic side effects of those drugs. Now, they do calm them down. Okay. They do quiet the voices. So they do handle the symptoms somewhat. They do anything about the cause. All right. So that once she told me that, I went, so that's why the psychiatrists were being assaulted at that rate. The voices are probably telling those patients that they're being poisoned also. Now, I've heard that several times from other schizophrenics saying, these medicines are poison. They're toxic, and they are. So,
But that's so interesting that these entities know that the biological body is being poisoned, but they're entities. Are they merging with the biology of the body? How do they know? Okay, their thought form. Can you describe what you have learned about the nature of these entities?
well,
Because I find it very interesting that they can feel the effects of the biology,
they
of the
feel the
trauma.
effects of the drugs. They don't like those drugs because it calms the patient down. Remember, they're parasites. They want that patient as upset as they can get him because they're feeding off of that negative emotional energy that person is generating. They can't generate that themselves. They have to
Yeah.
have it generated by us.
Yeah. And how did they know it was a toxin? How did the entities know this?
They didn't know it was a toxin and they didn't care. What they care about is the patient being upset. They don't want those drugs calming the patient down.
So that's the lie. Yes,
That's
they were creating all kinds of stories to make the patient fall off their path, or yeah.
right.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that they
Okay, I
don't
get
want the patient taking the drugs because those drugs calm the patient down.
you.
They don't want
Mm-hmm.
the patient calmed down. They want them upset. They want them paranoid. They want them generating that negative emotional energy. You know,
Mm-hmm.
if they feel bad because of the after effects of the drugs, that's even better. They want them feeling bad. They could care less about the patient they're infesting. They hate the human race. They especially hate kids.
Oh
They
wow.
totally hate kids, which is scary considering all this child molestation stuff and these child trafficking rings that are going on right now. Those are all demonic enterprises.
Yeah.
You know? And right now, the United States is one of the biggest purveyors of human trafficking on the planet. They're not tracking any of these children that are coming in. There's thousands of children who have come over the border. They have no idea where any of them went. Same thing
See,
with the
people
women.
don't, yeah, I'm glad that you've touched on that because people don't understand really what's going on. People like to talk about migration. Oh, these migrants are coming. But when you see children, first of all, when people come to travel, cross borders without identification, anything, and that's a haven for human trafficking because that's what traffickers need. It's like it's like a buffet
Oh, it
because you
is.
don't
They're the,
documentation. The children can go missing, nobody's looking
right,
because nothing is documented, so it's
right.
not just about migration. You have to really understand there's so much stuff going on with what you call, and it's good that you touched on that because people need to really look at the bigger picture.
Oh, they're
No
not.
papers, no identification, nothing is human trafficking.
Yeah, Brazil has emptied out a lot of their prisoners up here. It's just sent them up here. You got terrorists coming across the border. They are destroying the United States right now, and the Democrats are keeping it going. They're any bill to try to shut down the borders is killed by the Democrats. They're all paid off. They're all demonic.
Yeah, but migration is something else. I just know, as somebody who has worked with survivors of human trafficking, I know that some of the ways they get people to traffic is vulnerability, economics, finances, and documentation. Nobody cares, nobody loves you, then nobody's looking for you. I'm just summarizing, overgeneralizing
Right.
this. But
Plus, we got the Chinese down there paying for their transportation up here, paying for their water, their food, and giving them directions on how to get here and what to say when they get to the border. The Chinese are funding all that.
yeah. Yeah, but children need to. I mean, you need to really, when you mentioned that these entities that they don't like children, that's yeah, that's that you know again, these entities are, I think they're very disruptive. They're destructive in
Oh
so
yeah,
many
yeah,
ways.
they're very destructive
Yeah, and you mentioned how they influence people to sabotage
themselves.
their lives, and I'm just thinking, I think you're touching on many things that I think people know about, but they're not connecting the dots that these could be entities, because everyone tells you that's self-sabotaging behavior, but nobody asks why you did it.
Yeah, and you
People,
ask the person, would you do something like that to yourself on purpose? And they go, no.
yeah.
You know,
And that's also with couples. You hear people talk, people have,
oh,
I can't tell you how many times people have told me, me and my husband did this, and I'm like, what did you fight about? She's like, I don't even know. I don't remember.
see, and that's another thing they hate. They do
Hmm.
not like people being couples. They do not like families. So they do everything they can to disrupt couples. They'll tell them the man to, if one of them is hearing voices, you can bet your booties that the voices are telling that person that their partner is cheating on them, that they're doing this, they're doing that, they're doing all kinds of stuff. They want to break up relationships. They want to break up families.
Yeah, because people have heated conversation, arguments over conflicts, you know,
Yeah.
and this causes crazy outcomes. It leads to so many crazy stuff, and I'm like, was it really conflicts? And they're like, yeah, but and you now it's I'm connect, you're connecting the dots. They picked a trigger, then they added, on top, so they lowered your frequency, then now they have a doorway,
Yes.
to come in,
Yeah.
and then, let it fester,
Yep, that's exactly what they want. And the doorway is, when you have a negative thought, realize that it's not yours. You have to monitor your thoughts coming in because they're constantly transmitting. Now earlier you asked me, how did I come to the conclusion that these things were entities? Okay, so I suspected they were because of the patterns that they were running. So if they're running patterns, there's something that is keeping them on those patterns. They're not random.
mm-hmm.
And here's pattern after pattern after pattern after pattern showing up with hundreds of schizophrenics that I talk to. So this is this information is based on many hundreds of interviews with people who are hearing voices, paranoid schizophrenics, and they're all saying the same thing. Okay. So what I started doing after these patterns started appearing, I'm like thinking, okay, what would happen if I started throwing monkey wrenches in that pattern? What would happen if I started interfering with that pattern? You know, and I would tell them to do virtually the opposite of what the voices were telling them to do. And I couldn't do this in the state hospital because they'd already, they were too touchy. Here's the psychiatrist getting beat up by these patients, so they were already gun shy. They're going, the unwritten rule in the state hospital was you don't do anything to upset these guys that you don't have to. If you absolutely have to, then do it. But otherwise, you keep them calm. Don't do anything to upset them. Don't say anything to them to upset them. Just don't upset them, because the psychiatrists were getting beat up. Right? When I took the job at the state prison,
Mm-hmm.
okay, the state prison was set up for violence. It was set up for disruptions. If one of these patients that went to the psychiatrist at the psychiatric rehab center went to the warden at the state prison and said, hey, the psych is asking me questions about my voices that I don't like, the warden would go, you get out of my face, man. Go play in the traffic. I got better things to deal with than you being upset about being asked some questions.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't even come anywhere near breaking the level of conflict and disruption that is usually going on in those places. It just wouldn't even trigger a warning sign. So what I did is I collected around me a group of prisoners who were hearing voices, who agreed in real time to tell me what the voices were saying while we were in session in real time. And the deal I made with them was, okay, if you do this for me, I'll do everything I can to help you out. We'll see if we can't figure out what these voices are. And if you run into trouble, just throw a pebble at my window and I'll get you in as soon as I can. All right.
Mm.
So I had an agreement with these guys and it worked. So while we were in session, the voices would be saying stuff like, oh, don't listen to him. He's crazy. He's stupid. He's a nutcase. You know, don't do what he said. Don't show up for your sessions. Don't get up. Don't keep your appointments. You know, they were doing everything they could to drive these people away from me. All right. So at times it got a little bit hairy because the voices would, you know, there was one time where one of these guys came in and one of the guards insulted him in front of some other prisoners. And he said, the voices are telling me to stab this guy.
Oh, no.
You know, so if he did that and the prison administration found out that I knew about it and didn't turn him in, I'd be fired. Okay. You know, so on the other hand, I had to, if I did turn him in for saying that, then all of these guys would no longer trust me anymore. Mm-hmm. Every single one of them would back away and go, we can't trust him. As soon as we say something, he'll turn us into the guards and we're done.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
the investigation would be completely shot. I wouldn't, and not another prisoner on that yard would ever trust me because they already don't trust psych, because what the psychs do is they monitor for psychotic behavior that's getting out of control, and then they turn them into the psychiatrist who drugs them. Right. So already there's not a lot of trust. So I had to earn that trust. You know, but sometimes it got a little hairy. I think in the long run, it prevented more problems than it caused. You know, not one of those patients actually acted out against a guard, because I would increase the number of times I saw them until they were calmed down. Okay. But, you know, these patterns kept going on and on and on. And I'd give them stuff like the 23rd Psalm, say, okay, use that every time the voices come back next week and tell me what happened. Right? They would all report. They hated it. The voices hated it. They didn't like me saying it. You know, so I'd give them thing after thing after thing that would go against what the voices were saying.
Yeah, what they hate, the entities.
What they hate. So what happened is after a while, these guys started coming back to me in these sessions and saying, the voices are getting pissed with you. They don't want us coming here. They don't want us listening to you. They were giving me a crock of crap telling me this morning not to get up and go. They saying, call off your sessions. And this was happening with the whole bunch of them, you know, the whole 13 of them. All of a sudden, the voices don't like whatever I'm doing. Mm-hmm. Okay. And here's these reports coming and coming and coming. And I'm like, well, that's tough crap. Yeah. And then one of the guys that I was working with intensely and was doing good, he turns around in my doorway after one of our sessions and he looks me in the eye and he goes, you realize what you're doing is dangerous, don't you? And I never dawned on me. You know, I'm thinking, well, these voices are in your head. They're not in my head. They're not going to make me do anything. You know, I always suspected that they might make them do something. But, you know, I've been working extensively with these guys, some of them for like 6 months. So I trusted them and they trusted me, which is an odd situation for the prison. So I just looked at this guy and I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say. And he just turned around and he walked away. And I remembered that, but I didn't quite know what to do with it. You know, it was like a warning. It was like a warning shot across the bow. Right. So I kept working with him and a bunch of others. And then what was the next thing? Yeah, here's the warnings. The next thing, this guy comes back some weeks later. I don't know how he got into the medical unit, knocks on my door, and he goes, the voices want to talk to you. And that never happened before. It was always, the patient would always tell me what the voices were saying. Mm-hmm. You know, they'd be saying stuff like, he's crazy, he's stupid, don't listen to him. What he's telling you is a bunch of crap, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. You know, and then I'd tell them to, go tell the voices to go stick their head in the toilet or something like that. So it would be that kind of stuff.
Having this banter.
There'd be this back and forth kind of stuff, and then they'd tell me, the client would say, well, the voices are now telling me that, and I'd say, well, that's a lie. Can't you see it's a lie? Stuff like that. So he knocks on my door. He goes, the voices want to talk to you. And I'm kind of like surprised, because that had never, in 20 years previous, that had never happened before. It was always the patient was interpreting what the voices were saying and telling me what they were saying. It was never talking to me directly. So he knocks on the door. I open it up, and he goes, the voices want to talk to you. I said, they want to talk to me personally? He said, yeah, they want to talk to you personally. And I'm like, okay, come on in. Closed the door, said, have a seat, sat back, and I said, well, what did they have to say? And these words came out of his mouth. You have no right to interfere with our way of life. My head went boom, just exploded. It was like, our way of life, and I'm like, no, you're joking around with me, aren't you? He goes, no, I'm not joking around. That's what they said. And I said, well, tell them this. And he said, I don't have to tell them anything. They can see you. They can hear you. Yeah. And that weirded me out too. It's like, so my head is just boom. And it was at that moment that I realized that these things were separate entities, that they were not, they were not hallucinations. Here they were speaking. I was carrying on a conversation with them personally. And the prisoners, he would say, that's not me. I didn't say that. That's them. They were speaking. They were talking. I had nothing to do with what they were saying. So that warped my head, and I went into shock, because I was denying this for years. And now it breaks through, and it's going, we don't like what you're doing. We want you to stop. You have no right to do what you're doing. And I said something about, well, you're destroying these people. Yeah. And then he kind of gets up and leaves, and I'm in shock. I just shut down the office, and I didn't see anybody for the rest of the day. And there's nobody I could talk to about this, except the prisoners. They knew. I could talk to the people who were hearing voices. They would understand this stuff, but I couldn't talk to any of my colleagues. I couldn't talk to my wife. She was all, when I tell her what I was doing, she'd go, no, you shouldn't be picking through the heads of psychotic people and in the prison who are criminally insane. Yeah, what are you doing? Because so it was even her saying, don't do this thing. So I had nobody to talk to. Sherry was the first sane person that I was able to talk to about this stuff. She understood. So she was like a lifesaver, because I couldn't talk to my boss. I couldn't talk to other psychologists. I couldn't talk to anybody about this. So she was like a lifesaver. I could talk to her about this stuff, and then I could ask her questions. Of, what did you experience? Did you experience the same kind of stuff? So after some, and it was 10 years I knew her before she ever admitted that she had heard his voices as a young woman. So that's how much of a stigma this stuff carries. So after talking with her for a good while, we have to write a book. We have to tell people what's really going on. They have to know. So we wrote that book, An Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind, Breaking the Spell of the Ivory Tower. And it tells you how we came to these conclusions. So it didn't end there. So I was in shock for a good while after that, but I didn't stop working with this group of prisoners. Okay? So I read a book called The Voice of Knowledge by Miguel Ruiz. And I was always asking these prisoners questions.
Oh, Miguel Ruiz has beautiful books. Yeah, he's a good writer.
Right. He's good stuff.
Yes.
So I was always asking these guys questions, and I read a section of his book where he was talking about these voices as being parasites. There was a whole paragraph on it. So there was one guy I was working with that he was doing okay, And I said, I brought him in one day, and we're sitting there, and I said, I got a paragraph from this shaman who was talking about what appeared to me to be the voices. I want to read you this paragraph and tell me what you think about it. You know?
Mhm.
And so I started reading the paragraph, and it got to the point where the paragraph was talking about these entities being parasites.
Okay.
At that very moment, I looked at, I looked up, and he had this glazed look on his face. He looked like a zombie. He was just staring at me. And I'm like, uh-oh, this doesn't look good. And then all of a sudden I heard this behind me, this electrical crackling erupt behind my head. It sounded just like an arc welder. You know, it was like crack, 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 crackling, this crackling sound. And I'm like, what the frick is that? You know, so I look at him and I said, did you hear that? And he just keeps staring at me like he's in a zombie in some kind of daze. He doesn't answer. So this crackling kind of starts working up the right-hand wall of my office at a 45-degree angle. So it's like crack, 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 crack. And I'm looking and I don't see anything. I don't smell anything. I can just hear it, and it's moving. And it's moving toward the top corner, the right-hand corner of my office. And I'm afraid to take my eyes off of him because he looks so weird. So I push my chair against the wall in case he attacks. And I'm going, he's going to attack. You better keep your eye on him. So I push my chair against the wall, so if he does, he can't knock me over. So I can at least kick him back. Right? And then I'm trying to split my attention between keeping an eye on him and this loud electrical crackling. So it hits the ceiling, and it starts crackling along the top corner of my office, right across and over his head. So I'm able to keep an eye on him and look at where the crackling sound is coming from also. Right? And I'm watching this thing, but I still don't see anything. And he's just sitting there like a zombie, just staring at me like he's frozen.
And he can't hear the crackling. It's not a.
He,
It's
he
not a
didn't he
protection
didn't
thing.
respond when I asked him if he could hear the crackling. He just sat there staring at me. He did not
Yeah.
respond.
I'm bothered. Okay. Yeah.
And he's just staring like a zombie, stark still, sitting in the chair like he's frozen. And then the crackling starts coming down the left-hand wall where my chair is, and it's crackling down the left-hand wall. And then it jumps into this Rubbermaid trash can right by my left leg, and it's crackling in the trash can. So I'm watching him, and then I lean over and I look in that trash can, and there's nothing there. It's completely empty. The inmate porter had cleaned it the night before. There's not even a piece of paper in there, you know. And I look up at him, and I'm like blown out of my mind. And then he slowly gets up and he goes, I gotta leave. And he walks out of the office, like shuffles slowly out of the office, and then heads out the hall. And I'm like totally relieved. I'm like, yeah, get out of here. Go, stay out, you know. And I'm totally shocked. I'm like, what the hell just happened? So I go out into the hall and I check the doctor's and the nurse's office out there. Nobody's in yet. There's nothing out there that could have caused this loud electrical crackling.
Mhm.
So I walk out front. There's nothing out front of the medical unit that could have caused this. There's nothing plugged in, you know, and I'm just blown away. I mean, I couldn't function. I closed down my office. I didn't see anybody that day. I think I took the next day off. I was just completely shocked. Now there was no doubt in my mind that these things could affect physical reality. So before that, I was like, I had seen scratches where they had torn apart some of the inmates' backs, that the inmate woke up with bloody scratch marks across his back. But I was in denial that they could affect physical reality. When I heard this crackling in my office, that was physical reality. There was no doubt in my mind now that they could affect physical reality. The question I had is, what else could they do? I didn't know. I didn't know where this was going. I had no cognitive map. There was no book written on the voices. this was uncharted territory. Yeah. I didn't know what was going to happen to me if I kept crossing that boundary. I didn't know how dangerous this was. I thought at times I was losing my own mind. It's like hallucinating this crackle. And it was like 3 or 4 months before I got the nerve to call that prisoner back into my office. I didn't want to see him. Okay? Finally, I put out a pass for him to come, and he showed up. He's at the door of the psych department. I let him in, and he looks good. I was expecting him to be a wreck, a total wreck. Because if the voices could do that to him and turn him into a zombie, what else could they do? And he looked good. He had a lot of energy, which surprised me. And I mentioned that to him. I said, you look good. You look like you have a lot of energy. I said, I thought the voices would have just torn you to pieces by now. And he goes, no, I haven't gained a lot of ground, but I've stalled them out. They're not gaining any ground, but I'm not losing any either. So he says it's like a Mexican standoff with them. Yeah. And
he figured out how to.
So yeah, so he's kind of fighting them to a standstill. He's still hearing the voices. He's not believing a lot of what they say. They're not gaining any ground, but he's not getting any better either because he's still entertaining some of the stuff they're saying. Right? So I asked him, I said, you remember the last time you were in the office here? He goes, yeah, I remember. I said, did you hear that loud crackling at the time you were in here? He goes, yeah, I heard it. And I said, well, what in the blazes was that? And he said, well, that was them. And I said, them who? The voices? He goes, yeah, those were the voices. And I said, well, what in the heck were they doing? And he said, they were trying to scare you off. Wow. Right? And I'm like, do. This is like Twilight Zone stuff. This is. I used to watch this Twilight Zone all the time, and now I was in it. Here it was. Do. I could see Rod Serling just going right there. I could see him right there. Do. This psychologist did this, and then it was, and the do. It's like I was there. It's like
this time you're there.
I'm there. So And I was in shock. I went into a deep shock. I mean, my denial system completely collapsed. It was already tied together with baling wires and rubber band. I had overwhelming evidence that these things were not, they were not hallucinations. But then when they come out of this guy, and they're telling me, you have no right to interfere with our way of life. And then the inmate is swearing on the Bible that, it wasn't him who said that, and I trusted him. I mean, I had a relationship with him, and it was like, okay, what am I getting myself into? Where is this going to end up? I have no cognitive map. I don't know where this is going. I don't have, this is blind territory. This is, what am I going to do? It's either back off and cower down and stop the investigation, or just take my chances. Now, thank God I was an adrenaline junkie. If I wasn't, I probably would have backed down.
Adrenaline. So this was it had a little bit of excitement.
Well, yeah, there was nothing boring about it. That's for sure. Now this is what happens. This is what happens when the voices come close to taking somebody over. This was written by one of the patients I worked with.
Oh, wow. Oh, no. It's like they've lost total control of their body.
Right, the loss of control of their body and mind, both.
Yeah. And what I was going to ask you is, why do you think clinical psychiatry is not willing to take a leaf from religion, Christianity, the church? Because the Muslims know about this. They wouldn't be shocked.
The Muslims are much better. They're much better at realizing what's going on than the Christians are.
Even the Catholic Church, we've seen all the documentaries and movies where they do the exorcisms and stuff.
Yeah, and they're one of the few churches who do that.
Yeah, why is the clinical psychology not open to having this tandem? Where, I mean, you want to help the patient, if this is not working, maybe you want to have a tandem and take a leave from these other
Well,
modalities.
you would think so, but they don't. The clinical psychologists and the psychologists would say, I'm crazy. This is a bunch of crap. What I say to them is go to my site and look up those patterns. If you're working with schizophrenics, you will see those patterns for yourself. You can ask them questions. They will tell you that these are the patterns these things run. If they're running patterns, they can't be hallucinations. They don't want to change their cognitive view of anything. Here they are, spent their lives studying psychology, and when I got to the front lines, I spent 2 years in a PhD program. I couldn't stand it any longer. It was brainwashing. It was like, oh, you're one of the elite now, and they're teaching you all this stuff that wouldn't make a hills of difference on the front lines.
Yeah.
Now, when I ran into Mace, that made a huge difference on the front lines.
Yeah, talk to us about the Mace treatment, because I guess if we are waiting for psychology to catch up,
Well, people
are going to suffer, right?
Well, it's the same phenomena as when, who was it? Galileo said the world was round.
Mm-hmm.
And they persecuted him for that.
Yeah.
They don't want to change their thinking. They have all this power, that all their money depends on this, their jobs depend on it. The psychiatric mafia, they're depending on everybody believing this crock of lies that big pharma and the psychiatric mafia have put out. Their jobs depend on it.
Yeah, and academia is very rigid. Anyone who's been through
very rigid, and you don't question them.
Rigid, and they have such a huge ego,
Yes.
But even in their own speech and what they say these are theories. When you write your paper, it's theoretical knowledge. So it's a theory. Anyone can debunk it, come up with a new theory, but they don't even accept. It's such a strange system, but they have such a huge ego. And they give you, it has to be peer reviewed by everyone who's.
Oh, yeah, peer reviewed by a bunch of people who don't know crap.
Yeah.
So this is what I'm faced with at the present time. All I can say is go to the list of patterns that these voices run on my website at jerrymarzinsky.com under articles and see for yourself. This isn't hidden in genetics. There's no mystery to it. There's no biochemical imbalance thing that you can't see for yourself. You can see these patterns run for yourself, and know that if these voices are running patterns, they're not hallucinations like the psychiatric mafia and big pharma insist they are. Hallucinations don't run patterns. Okay, so here's the evidence for yourself. You could go see it for yourself. It's right there. Okay, so what they're doing is they don't realize that these entities are energetic entities.
Energetic.
Yeah, they're energetic entities. They don't have a physical form. They don't. There is no time. There is no space. There is no matter in the universe where they operate. Okay, so they can follow a schizophrenic to the depths of the ocean. He can move from here to Timbuktu, and the voices are still there. There is no time or space or matter where they're at, so they can travel instantaneously. Wherever they want to go, they can follow that person anywhere. Okay, so Mace is an energetic therapy. Okay, so it deals with energy. So memory is energy, feelings are energy, thought is energy, your spirit is energy. So these entities are energy, but they are negative energy. Okay? And they're trying to create more negative energy out of the person. Okay? So the biggest source of psychological problems is trauma. It's either physical, sexual, or emotional trauma. Okay? And as I was explaining earlier, during that trauma, the person makes a decision about who they are and it's not a good one. Right? And
Mhm.
that gets buried in their subconscious because the feeling is awful. So you have this trauma, you have this horrible feeling, and you just can't get rid of it. So the ego shows up and it goes, let me handle this. And it takes it and it buries it in your subconscious mind and then locks it down. But it's buried alive. It's not dead. Okay? So then you have this that phenomena we talked about where somebody shows up who reminds you of somebody who abused you. They're not the same person, but they remind you of that. And then you automatically don't like them, or you find yourself attacking them or avoiding them. Okay.
Yeah. Or
So,
you could have experienced, a war and you lost all your family, That's a
yes.
huge trauma that is very hard to recover from, especially as a child. All of a sudden everyone's gone. And
Right.
now we look at all the wars, they must be having a frenzy in these places
Oh,
where
they
they
are. Yeah,
inject.
they're having a hogs fest with this war in Ukraine. They are just that's like a hog's trough for them. They are just feeding relentlessly there. You
But
look at
there's
all
everywhere.
the
There's
people who are suffering
Palestine.
and dying there.
Yeah, there's Palestine, there's Congo, there's so many of them,
Yes.
right? There's so many, and we're talking about millions of people, not just a handful.
And they
So if
they
this
they
is what they
foment.
need to thrive, then, here we go, right?
Yeah, and they foment these wars. They foment them. You look at what the West is doing right now. All these Western countries, they're totally psychotic. If you look at this list of patterns that I have listed here, there's a one-to-one correspondence between what's coming over the mainstream media right now and what the Western leaders are saying and what these voices tell schizophrenics. You look at it, they're negative. All this negative news coming down, all these lies coming out about what Russia's doing.
Interesting.
You know,
Yes.
you look at Ukraine. Zelensky has banned religion there. He's cut people out of the church. They foster and create negative emotion. Look at all the negative emotion that's being created by these wars. You know,
But
it's just
also the media, I think we underestimate the power of negative media because you can traumatize people through the perpetuation of fear, 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 fear,
right. They're
without
they're
solutions.
they're
So people
perpetuating this fear,
yeah.
just like they did with the uh, this. I don't want to say that. This.
Yeah, I know what you want to say. Yeah, no, it
Yeah,
doesn't.
I mean they fostered and perpetuated that. And it was lie after lie after lie after lie after lie, and they're still telling these lies. And right now they're blaming Russia, for Russia invaded Ukraine. No, Ukraine was run by the Khazarian mafia. It's one of the most corrupt countries on the planet. You know, it the U.S. and the politicians here were laundering millions of dollars through Ukraine. They were
But you
bombing.
notice the back and forth, there always has to be this back and forth. You know, you did this and you did this, but in between they're casualties, while people are
Yes,
fighting about their ideologies and their politics and their money and power and control, their real human lives who are casualties of
right.
this
And
struggle.
these negative entities don't want you to even consider that. Oh, this is happening in Ukraine. That's thousands of miles away. It doesn't affect you. And you're
Wow,
right.
that's
There's massive suffering over there because of this. And even the Russians are suffering horribly also.
yeah, but
You
the
know?
suffering is everywhere, Jerry. There's Haiti just next door to you guys. That's not very
Oh
far.
yeah. No,
You
it's
don't have to go all
everywhere.
the way to Ukraine to see this. I mean, there's so much, even across the border I mean, it's everywhere. It's
Yes.
it's
And
everywhere.
and
Right now,
these
yeah,
and
it's not
these
just
these
one country. Also that they focus on one place, that everyone should focus on this. For the longest time, there was a lot going on in Yemen. Nobody was talking about that. So
right.
and it's constant. Now when you talk about these entities and the Archons and the energetic food that they need, you can see that the way things play out, they ensure a constant supply. you
Yes.
know and so if it's not been supplied from the Congo for centuries, I think it's been supplied from Yemen. It's been supplied. Now there was Ukraine, there's Palestine, there is Haiti, there is where else we could go, El Salvador, it's
Yeah,
always somewhere.
it
Cuba,
goes on and on and on
the
and on.
Middle East also, there's so many countries there. So yeah, I think this is quite interesting. So Jerry, I think
Yeah.
I want to thank you so much for coming. This has been quite an eye-opening conversation, and I want to thank you really for coming and sharing this what you have discovered in the field of psychiatry. I think you have shed a lot of light into what people may not know exists in psychiatry, that there is actually a dark side to it. It's not just the clinical studies and the pills and the tablet, but actually there is more that we should investigate further. And I'd like you to have the last word and maybe share something that we might have missed and that you'd like to share with our listeners.
Okay, I want to cap off what you were saying. So I found this on the internet. It said in the past 200 years, over 100 million people on Earth have lost their lives due to war. Over a time span of 3,358 years, only 23 of those years were peaceful on the planet. Okay. So the other thing I'd like to say is, if you're struggling with a mental health problem, please try the Mace therapy method first. You can go to www.causisminstitute.com. That's CAUSISMINSTITUTE.com. And there will be a list of Mace therapists available. So they will treat the cause of the problem and not just the symptoms. Okay. And psychiatry and psychology don't want this getting out. They're not supporting it because it is threatening to them to have a system that can treat the cause of psychological problems instead of just the symptoms.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much, Jerry. And to all our listeners, thank you for stopping by. I want to remind you all that you were listening to our smart guest, Jerry Marzinsky. All his information will be in the description. So make sure you stop by, have a look, and click on the links. There are a lot of very useful resources, including the Mace therapy, which we will add to the description, and see what piques your interest, and then just go for it and just share it, because I think mental health is just one of those things that people may not be comfortable talking about. So you can just share it and see, let people decide for themselves what could be relevant for them and their loved ones. So thank you once more, Jerry. Thank you. And to all our listeners, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.